Hello students, welcome to APG Pathshala. I am Dr. Haren Ram Sehari from Kirodimal College, University of Delhi, Department of Zoology. Today we are going to discuss about a module community characteristic, type of biodiversity, diversity index, abundance, species richness and vertical and horizontal stratification part 4th under the paper Principles of Ecology. After studying this module, you shall be able to understand the meaning of succession and the history of study of succession. Briefly study the type of succession, learn about the general pattern of primary and secondary succession, evaluate different stages of Hydrosere succession and Lithosere succession, understand different theories of climate community. More or less, but communities are regularly changing over a time and thus they are dynamic entities. Each community has its own developmental history with its particular prevailing environment and time. The source of studying the growth and development of ecological community can be a barren area. The development of community initiates on arrival of propagules or their parent organisms to the area of study. Out of all the immigrating organisms or propagules, only few of them survives, grow and gets established at the new site. The first developmental stage of community is called as pioneering community, which is made up of those few successfully survived and established organisms or their propagules. As more and more new species immigrates to this site, the competition for the resources become more intense between them. Due to the activities of the survival species and physiography and constant changes in the climatic conditions, the prevailing environmental conditions keep on changing. The nature work on the principle of survival of the fittest and thus support only those organisms which are adapts and fit best to the changing environmental conditions. Until the community become in complete accordance with the environment and become a relatively stability community, the process of development and changes in community continues. The changes occurring during the entire process of community development is ordered and highly directional. These highly directional and sequences changes in the community are called as succession. History of the study of succession. Europeans have already described the coastal dunes related succession when in 1899 Henry Cowles got inspired from his study and started his study on sand dunes along Lake Michigan. He defined the laws essential to the changing patterns of the community and influenced many ecologists of new generation. He viewed plant communities and documented that these communities differ in the underlying physical environment and species composition and are dynamic in nature. The plant communities in sand dunes were studied at different ages in order to reflect the patterns of changes in the community over time. Since then, many other ecologists along with Cowles studied the succession process by using the chronosequence approach. This temporal approach to study succession process is difficult to follow for centuries or decades and thus replaced by another approach that uses subtle differences between communities to interfere the occurrence of succession. Subtle differences means locations of different ages are compared to understand the process of succession. Seer is defined as the stage in the succession sequence. ecologists identified animals as the factors that affect the rate of direction of succession along with different patterns of succession. Although the taxonomical groups such as rodents, fish, protozoans, and insects, and all type of ecosystem such as marine or aquatic etc. are being investigated to study succession. Ecological succession and types, primary and secondary succession. In ecology, the community structure involves over time and the process of this process is termed as ecological succession. Over a period of time, the replacement of one population or community by other is called as succession. The sequence of change in the type of communities subsequently relates different community types and describe the landforms or soil or total site succession and vegetation succession. Ecological succession is majorly categorized into primary and secondary succession. Based on the association between individual with their biotic and abiotic factors, ecologists suggest two types of succession process, primary and secondary succession. Primary succession, the establishment of a community in an area never been inhabited by organisms or where no prior existence of life is evidenced. The presence of complete lifeless empty area may be because of greater natural disaster such as lava flow, sand dunes, or via glacier newly introduced rocks, etc. Over a period of time, few living organisms manage to sustain life in these empty areas, and with continuous succession varieties of life forms begins to grow in the area. Secondary succession. The more common type of succession in secondary succession where the existed life forms of community are partially destroyed by small scale of disturbances, for example forest wildfire, for a period of time with remaining nutrients in an environment. The area remains empty, but gradually life begins to reappear and communities changes over time. In both type of succession, the size, inten- uh, intensities, and frequency of change in species vary with communities while altering the area or habitat, leading to mixture of species exploiting the prevailing conditions of community. The species evolve life histories in a partially predictable sequential way and leads to gradual progressive changes in species composing the community. Initially, in the unfavorable environmental condition of these disturbed habitat, only few species from the surrounding areas invaded, and then they modify the habitat by alterations such as soil component compositions, amount of sunlight or shade or grounds, etc. The first community established in an originally completed lifeless land is called pioneer community, and the plants and animals are called pioneer plants or animals. After these successive changes in habitat environment, a stable community is archived, termed as climax community by few prominent species. The community with this stable state of equilibrium is termed as climax community. Thus, climax community is categorized by stable environment conditions limiting any further admission of other species in the community. At each successive community, the replacing species are more complex. Other than climax community, other communities at the time of succession undergo small scale environmental disturbances, thereby offering species diversity with equal probability of each species to become dominant. Stages of ecological succession. A process of ecological changes where established communities are replaced by more evolved natural communities is called as succession. Depending on the type of area over which succession has been take place, mainly two types of succession occurred: primary and secondary succession. Primary succession, when completely lifeless bearer area starts succession, it is called as primary succession. Secondary succession, when succession starts from an area which has been once occupied by vegetation but become vegetation free due to some disturbances, the mechanism called as dunation or secondary succession. The disturbances can be become of strong wind, fire, rains and cultivation. The stages of ecological process of primary succession includes following stages. Number first, nudation. Nudation is a stage occurred when greater disturbances leads to formation of a barren land uninhabited by any plant or animal species. The disturbing factors can be biotic because of human activities or abiotic like climate, fire, hails, glaciation, etc. or topographic, wind action, soil erosion, etc. This uninhabited land can sustain only autotrophic species, consuming inorganic substances and offering a new environmental condition for inhabitation of newer species. For instance, rocks are break down to soil with the help of acidic substances secretion by lichens. These lichens act as pioneer species in the community. 2. Migration or invasion. Migration is a two-way direction movement or mechanism of dispersal and a group characteristic feature of population. The productive propagules such as spores, seeds, etc. migrate from the species establishment into a new area. Non-native organisms called invasive species enter from the neighboring environment and spread widely in a community. These invasive species are responsible for community disturbances and thus are threat to the stable ecosystem, but in the succession process they aid in altering the environmental conditions such as soil composition, function and texture. Our strategists with the high fecundity rate and high dispersal rate are the first colonizers. 3. Ecesis. On the basis of soil composition, the initial establishment of community is called colonization. The initial community proliferates abundantly. Allogenic mechanisms of succession are those which are completely driven by the abiotic factors, that is environment mediated and completely regulated the eciosis process. Eciosis happens when different pioneer species are sustained after the dispersal in an area. They have different germination, growth, and reproduction rates, and that's why the pioneer species take much longer time and gradual replacement of other species. By the establishment of these pioneer species, the texture and composition of soil changes, which leads to germination of seeds already present but were not able to germinate. 4. Aggregation. The established species in the area increases in population, and this increase in population density is called as aggregation. As an example, in most successions of plant community, small herbs is been replaced by shrubs and further inhabitants are supported by this as a source of food. 5. Competition. As a result of aggregation, few pioneer and initial species got established, an increase in population which further leads to enhanced intraspecific and interspecific competition among the species. This stage of competition is for the resource utilization like shelter, nutrients, water, etc. Plants and animal species both exhibit the stage of competition and leads to either competitive exclusion where no two species utilizing same resources can coexist or resource partitioning where two competing species share their part of resources and can coexist. 6. Reaction. The established species in the habitat modify the environmental conditions, subsequently leads to gradual replacement of older species by newer ones as the conditions are now become unfavorable for the survival of older species. This type of succession include autogenic mechanism driven by the biotic factors in which existing species themselves modified the environmental conditions, offering harsh conditions for their own survival. Pioneer colonizers facilitate the colonization of mature K-selected species. 7. Stabilization. The mechanism of climax community colonization is termed as stabilization. Climax community is a final state of equilibrium, stable, self-perpetuating, and mature stage of succession. The entire community is now being supported by the altered abiotic factors, chemical and physical conditions. Climax community generally made up of K-selected species, adapts according to the area of succession and are well established until any further external disturbances. The structure, composition and energy flow is very much specific for climax community and thus represent a well adapted steady state of equilibrium. The process of secondary succession is almost similar to primary succession except some steps. Also, as secondary succession starts from an initial state already enriched in soil nutrients and the process occur at much faster rate than primary succession. The limiting factor in secondary succession is the disturbances. Both type of succession result into stable and steady state of ecological equilibrium called climax community. This figure represent general pattern of subsequential succession. Different type of succession in plants. Halosere, if the plant succession starts from saline water or salty soil, this is called halosere. Hydrosere, hydrarch, is when succession of plants start from aquatic environment and the subsequent changes in the vegetation is called hydrosere or hydrarch. Xeroarch or xerosere. When the vegetation starts from a dry land, the process of succession is called as xerosere or xeroarch. The two types of xeroarch are lithosere and pesomosere. Lithosere succession when begins from the rock's surfaces. Pesomosere, it is the succession that occur on sandy habitat. Cerule, if succession start from decaying woods, tree barks, etc. is called as cerule. It includes microorganism succession such as fungi or bacteria. All cere ends into mesic community irrespective of succession types. Process of succession in Hydrosere. When succession of vegetation starts from a water body such as pond, it is called as hydrarch or hydrosere. The stages in hydrosere hydrarch are briefly described below. Number first, plankton stages. The pioneer community consists of cysted spores which germinate first in the new lakes or ponds. Spores are disappeared their uninhabited places by dispersal agents such as animals or wind. Population of phytoplanktons includes phytoflagellates, autotrophic diatoms, cyanobacteria, etc., which can be withstand or the harsh conditions and are regulated, controlled by zooplanktons. When these phytoplanktons are dead, they decay into organic substances and after mixing with slate forms soft mud at the base of the water body. 2. Rooted submerged stage Utricularis hydrilla Velinaric, etc. are the rooted submerged hydrophytes which grows on the soft mud at the water body bottom. When these hydrophytes are dead, their organic matter along with the sand and slate leads to deposition of extra soil layer at the top of the soft mud, and this give gradual rises to the bottom level of water body, example ponds. All the decaying matter is a good sources of human for nest successive vegetation. Rooted floating stage, Trappa, Nymphia, Nilumbo, Monocoria, etc. are the leaved, floating and anchored hydrophytes which invade the area and make it mineral and organic matter enriched. After these anchored plants, Limna, Azolla, Acornia, Pista, etc. are the new free-floating hydrophytes. The decaying matter of these plants will make the water level shallow. 4. Reed swamp stage. Hydrophytes like Sagittaria, Typha, Screpus, etc. replace the rooted and free-floating stage of succession and are called as amphibious stage. These plants use transpiration of mechanism for large amount of water loss and are a source of huge amount of organic waste. These waste materials of organic matter settle down at the pond's bottom and make the environment unfavorable for these amphibious plant growth and development. 5. Sedge meadow stage. This stage is mainly habituated by hydrophytes like Juncus, sedge, carex, dicontium, and herbs such as Polygonum, Catha, etc. This stage of succession is also called as Mars meadow stage. These vegetations have a characteristic rhizomatous system which forms a mat-like covering, and this developed a magic condition which is unsuitable for their own growth. 6. Woodland stage. Serbi plants like Caplanthus, Cornus, etc. invades at the periphery of area. These Serbi plants can tolerate waterlogged situation and bright sunlight. Later, other invading plants also grow there such as Alnus, Populus, etc. The soil buildup amount of minerals increases and further falling of these trees into the ponds leads to enhanced soil formation, which further favors next serial community of colonization. 7th, forest stage. Forest stage is dependent on climatic conditions and lead to climax community. For instance, tropical rainforest within heavy rainfall areas, tropical deciduous forest in moderate rainfall habitats, etc. are the forest stages. This figure represents the stages in Hydrosere or Hydrarch. Process of succession in Lithosere. Another example of succession can be studied by understanding the succession occurring in the dry land. Succession initiate from the dry land is called Hydrarch. Hydrosere is further categorized into Lithosere, defined as succession sequence which begins from the rock surfaces. The succession sequence in the growth and development of Lithosere community includes following stages. Number first, lichen stages. The pioneer community is composed of lichen species such as Rhinodina, Rhizocorpone, and Leconorma. This stage is called as crustose, and the species of this stage can be tolerated disciation. The lichens grow on the rock surface by secreting acidic substrate which will be corroded the rocks and produce minerals and gaps within the rocks. These gaps are filled with organic matter and soil particles as a result of wind action and initiate forming of soil. 2. Moss stage. Rhymia and Polytrichum are the two moss which invades in an area due to the thin layer of soil on rock surfaces. After some time, these mosses will accumulate more soil particles, water, and organic matter and lead to colonization of moisture-loving mosses such as Bryum, Hyper, etc., and thus called as moss stage of succession. 3. Herb stage. Moss when decomposed into organic matters forming a mat cover fragmented rock and provided a substratum for the seed germination of annual grasses such as Aristicula, Illumination, Poa, etc. The death and decay of these grasses leads to replacement of the vegetation by perennial grasses such as Heteropogone, Cymbopogon, etc. Invasion of small animals were also encountered at this stage of succession. 4. Herb stage. Colonization of shrubs such as Gyphus, Caprius, and Russus are favorable of rock weathering and mineralization. Shrubs are larger than herbs in size with deep root penetration and further leading to soil formation via rock weathering. Fifth, forest stage. The environmental is now favorable for the colonization of hard and stunted trees requiring sunlight for the growth. Mesophytic types of vegetation is supported by the environmental factors and thus lead to an equilibrium, stable and steady state of succession between biotic community and environment. For example, coniferous forest in temperate region, etc. are the climax community. This figure represents the stages in Xerosere or Lithosere. This figure represents successional stages involved in the succession of Hydrosere and Xerosere or Lithosere, both resulting into much stable climax forest community. Theories of climax community. The succession of community structure attains a stable and final equilibrium state called climax community suggested by Simwell 1971 and Clintmans 1936. This stable community is in accordance with the predicting biotic and physically environment and is self-perpetuating. Birth rate, death rate, and growth process induce structural changes in climax community. The following are the four theories of climax community. First, monoclimax theory. In 1936, Clements suggested the monoclimax theory of succession, according to which all communities of different reasons to reach climax community. He believed that climate is a determining functional factor of climax and vegetation is solely influenced by the climatic conditions of community. This climate-based theory termed various stages of succession process as subclimax, this post and pre-climax with stabilized climax as last stage of community. Other than climate control community, exceptional cases of edaphic, soil, topographic, and biotic factors influencing communities are also discussed under this theory. 2. Polyclimax theory. In 1939, Tansley proposed polyclimax theory, which was supported by Dauber-Meyer 1966. According to this theory, in an area, the climax community may have varied type of vegetation, and these are called as climaxes. These climaxes are influenced not only by the climate rather by the activities of animals, soil nutrients and moisture, etc. Unlike monoclimax theory, climate is one factor among all other influencing factors regulating the stability and structure of climax community and allows multiple climaxes and thus called as polyclimax theory. In 1994, Krebs suggested that it is the time-dependent relative stability measurements which differentiate between two theories. The factors influencing climax varies with geological timescale and ecological timescale such as climate. Thus, different vegetation develops to reach different climax leading to a continuous succession. Therefore, the monoclimax theory and polyclimax theory mainly differ on understanding the functional factor which is responsible for establishing the steady state climax theory community. Number third, climax pattern theory. In 1953, Victor proposed the climax pattern hypothesis. The climax pattern theory of succession holds that the existing ecological community is affected by the entire pattern of environmental factors. The environmental factor influencing the community can be climate site, activity of animals, biotic, soil, species, genetic, structure, plant and animal species, dispersal, wind and fire, etc. This theory emphasizes on the total environmental conditions regulating the pattern of population constituting the climax community. There is no single functional factor influencing the climax community and thus there is no mono or polyclimax. Unlike monoclimax hypothesis resulting into one climatic climax is an area and several climaxes in the polyclimax theory. The climate pattern theory allows continuous inseparable climax type under the influence of gradually changing gradient of environmental conditions. 4. Climax as vegetation. In 1954, Egler hypothesized in a broad sense that the whole pattern of vegetation represents the climaxes. He favored the vegetation study of an area as by the careful observation of the vegetation we can predict the community conditions. Thus, from these entire hypotheses, we can conclude that the ultimate goal of succession is to achieve a stable form of community structure called climax. The climax community can be disturbed and incompletely stable. The vegetation of an area is totally controlled by the existing climatic conditions, but the broad climatic zones lead to many climax populations under the influence of animal activities, topographic and soil compositions. This figure represents flowchart depicting different theories of climax community. So student, let us summarize what we learned in these modules. Communities are regularly changing or dynamic entities. The development of the community initiates on the arrival of propagules or their parent organism to the area of the study. The first development stage of the community is called as the pioneering community, which is made up of those few successfully survived and established organisms or their propagules. The nature supports only those organisms which adapts and fit best to the changing environmental conditions. The changes occurring during the entire process of community development is ordered and highly directional. until the community become in complete accordance with the environmental and become a relatively stable community. The process of development and changes in a community continues. This highly directional and sequences changes in the community are called as succession. Many ecologists along with Colles studied the succession process by using the chrono sequences approach. This temporal approach is later replaced by another approach that uses septal differences between communities. Septal differences means locations of different ages are compared to understand the process of succession. Sere is defined as the stage in the succession sequence based on the association between individual with their biotic and abiotic factors. Ecologists suggested two types of succession process: primary and secondary succession. Primary succession, the establishment of a community in an area never been habituated by organisms or where no prior existence of life is evidenced. The more common type of succession is secondary succession, where the existed life forms of the community are partially destroyed by small-scale disturbances, for example, forest wildfires. Initially, in the unfavorable environmental conditions of this disturbed habitat, only few species from the surrounding area invaded, and then they modify the habitat by alterations such as soil component compositions, amount of sunlight or shades on a grounds, etc. The first community established in an originally completely lifeless land is called pioneer community, and the plants and animals are called pioneer plants or animals. After these successive changes in habitat environment, a stable community is archived termed as climax dominated by a few prominent species. The community with this stable state of equilibrium is termed as climax community. Thus, climax community is characterized by stable environment conditions limiting and further admission of other species in the community. The stages of ecological process of primary succession includes following stages: nudation, migration or invasion, eccesis, aggregations, competition, reaction, and stabilization. The process of secondary succession is almost similar to primary succession, except some steps. The limiting factor in secondary succession in the disturbances both types of succession result into stable and steady state of ecological equilibrium called climax community. Halosere, Hydrosere, zero arc or Xerosere, Lithosere and Pesomere and Cerule are the different type of ecological succession occurring in the plant communities. The stages in Hydrosere hydarch succession include initial plankton stage followed by secondary stage like rooted submerged stage, rooted floating stage, reed swamp stage, sedge meadow stage, woodland stage and forest stage, ultimately leading to climax community. The succession initiate from the dry land is called as zero arc or xerosere is further categorized into lithosere, defined as the succession sequence which begins from the rock surfaces. The succession sequences in the growth and development of Lithosere community include stages such as lichen stage, moss stage, herb stage, shrub stage, and forest stage. Birth rate, death rate, and growth process induce structural changes in the climax community. The following are the four theories of climax communities: monoclimax theory, polyclimax theory, climax pattern theory, and climax as a vegetation theory. Thank you.